Okay, so hi everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us at this Fireside Chat with AAWW Director Jafreen Uddin. My name is Piyali Bhattacharya. I am a writer of fiction and nonfiction. I'm the editor of an anthology called Good Girls Marry Doctors, and I am artist in residence at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'll be teaching fiction and nonfiction workshops starting this fall. I'm also just a family member of the Asian American Writers Workshop community, and so I'm really thrilled to be here today in conversation with Jafreen, partially because I wanted to kind of talk to you guys about what this is, the sort of Fireside Chat series that AAWW has started recently. And the aim of this series is to kind of sort of flip the script a little bit. Usually what the Asian American Writers Workshop does is they're bringing in authors and they're kind of talking to them about their work. And in this Fireside Chat series, we're kind of flipping it around, and writers like me get to come in and ask Jafreen, who has somewhat recently taken over the directorship of the Asian American Writers Workshop, questions about what she sees as being her role in the directorship and how she's been feeling about the organization kind of from a writer's eye point of view. So I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much, Jafreen, for having me.
Thanks, Piyali. I'm so excited to be in conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been looking forward to this. So I'm just going to jump right into some of my questions. And the first one that I wanted to talk about, it's a big topic, and I know it's something that we talk about a lot, and it's something that we keep talking about. And maybe we keep talking about it because we kind of need a place to keep updating this conversation. But I think one of the things that I really wanted to ask you about was, what do we mean when we say the phrase Asian American Writers Workshop? It's a big phrase. It has meant a lot of things over the number of years that AAWW has been in existence. But what does it mean to you as someone invested in the literary arts, as someone who is South Asian American, and as someone who has been recently directing the AAWW?
Thanks, Piyali. I think so. The term Asian American specifically is broad, and I think it's reflective of our ethos of being radically inclusive. And I think if there's anything that we've learned in this past year, it's how connected we all are, and how important it is to really show up for each other. And it's in that spirit that we really embrace the radical inclusivity and kind of the broadest definition of Asian American possible. Our community members include people from the Middle East. It includes South Asia. You know BIPOC generally, right? We stay broad intentionally because we firmly believe that we're stronger together, and there is something to be said about showing up for each other and demonstrating that necessary solidarity and allyship. At the same time, something that we talk a lot about internally, and something that we really are comfortable contending with, is the tension of the term. Asian American, if recent times has also brought up questions about citizenship, and who are we excluding and who are we marginalizing with that term. There are moments where it's maybe not as inclusive as we might want it to be, and we don't shy away from really embracing that tension and contending with it. And I think we can do multiple things at the same time. I think we can embrace this radical inclusivity ethos, um, while also understanding the challenges that come with certain terminology. I mean, language is not perfect, um, but also honoring the term and its history, right? It evolved out of a political movement in American history from a bunch of college students. And what does it mean to have that term in the public sphere? I think honoring the history is as important as embracing a more radical, inclusive definition of it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more because I mean, I've had conversations over the years about what does Asian American mean. I teach a course on Asian American literatures, and I think it's just it's a term that has so many different definitions, and sometimes it's a contested term. And it's really great to sort of, as the Asian American Writers Workshop, be aware of all of that history and be thinking about it. And then and of course these conversations need to be happening. And then of course there's the magic of the term, which, you know, I've said before, but like, you know, when I discovered the Asian American Writers Workshop as a high schooler, growing up in New York, I heard that term and I immediately knew what it meant. And for I think maybe one of the first times in my life, I thought that that term applied to me. And there
Mhm.
were so many moments in my life up until then where I had felt like, oh, that's not a term that applies to me. That's not a thing that applies to me. But when I heard the phrase Asian American Writers Workshop, I thought, hey, maybe that's me. And like that really, that the power of that was really tremendous. And it continues to be tremendous. It's part of what the workshop is about. And so I know that we have so many talks about these definitions, and it is so broad. I was just listening to the AAWW podcast, where the editors and writers of Colonize This, the edited volume, were speaking and reading at the workshop, back in the before times when that was possible. But I was listening to the podcast version of that, and I was thinking, like, look at the women who are reading here. I mean, it's like it's women and non-binary people. You know, like it's an incredibly diverse array of backgrounds, and that's also what the workshop does, which is like part of the reason why we're all here. So actually talking about people who are sort of connected with the workshop, one of the things that I really wanted to ask you about was one of the things that I think that the AAWW does so extraordinarily well is the idea of including various different kinds of not just writers, but also different kinds of artists, in the fold. And I think one of the ways in which at least I've understood it to do that, is by its fellowship opportunities. And I think the workshop runs two different kinds of fellowships, and they're also extraordinarily broad. So I was wondering if you could talk a little about each of those fellowships and how they work.
Yeah, I love our fellowship programs. So we have two fellowship programs, as you described. The Margins Fellowship is for writers working on book length projects of work, which in itself is such a broad category. Like, what does that even mean? But it's, just we keep it broad intentionally again. Um, the Open City Fellowship focuses more on reporting and journalism and telling the stories of immigrant communities as they're being lived. I think both of them, what they both do is really provide a space for emerging writers. And we often use the word incubator. I don't use that term lightly. I think a lot about what we're doing to foster and support a new generation of writers, and the fellowship programs are such a key part of that. We like to talk about how we engage with writers at every stage of their career. And we've had fellows who come back a few years later and celebrate the book launch of their, critically acclaimed debut. And we've had fellows come back and mentor future cohorts of fellows. We've had people who maybe publish on the magazine, end up joining the fellowship program, and or just are a regular community member attending events. I think the fellowship programs are such an important piece of this constant feedback loop that we're creating, where there's not just one entry point for anybody to engage with and interact with the workshop. It's we intentionally create multiple entry points, so that people can meet us where they are. You might just want to be an attendee and come and listen to all the events, and that's fine. You might be a working writer who's looking for some guidance and some support and some mentorship. The fellowships are there for that. You might be looking for a place to publish. That the magazine is there for that. I think the fellowships are such a critical piece of that overall attempt to really meet people where they are, and give people as many entryways as possible to the workshop.
That's so valuable because I've been thinking about this a lot recently, especially since I've started teaching. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is the word mentorship. And partially I've been thinking about it a lot because you know, it took me, for somebody who knew she was a writer from a really, really young age, it took me a really long time to become a writer. And part of the reason for that was that I don't think I had proper mentorship, like for a
Mhm.
long time. And I don't really think I had, I had a very supportive and loving family, and then I had an English major from college, which is not really the same thing as creative writing. And it just, it wasn't, it was all wonderful, but it wasn't the right mix of things. And I feel like, if that had been something that I had been more like open to or like looking for, something like this could have been like a really like sort of life-changing difference. And I think one of the things that I look at when I see the fellows is like, again, their work is just so broad. Like, whether they're working on book length manuscripts or not, that, some of them are screenwriters from what I can tell. Some of them are sort of anywhere from like sort of Middle Eastern to East Asian. Like it's descended. It's a completely diverse set of people, which and
Yeah.
not just background wise, but also just interest wise, which feels really like a cool space to be in, and also feels like the space that the workshop provides, even for us writers. Like that's kind of the cool.
Totally. And I think, even beyond say mentorship, just being able to find that writing community
Yeah,
and that group of people. And I think, so much of what we miss about in-person events is that physical community.
totally.
And, we can talk a little bit later about what we've been doing to try to replicate that. But um, you know, one anecdote that I think often about is in this past year, I've talked to a lot of people related to the workshop, kind of past, present. Um, and so many times people have said, I don't remember which space we were in at the time because the workshop has switched locations multiple times. Um, and they'll often say, like, I don't remember which space it was, but I remember how I felt. Like, I remember that experience. And I think that's really special. And the fellowships are such a big piece of that larger writing community and home that we really are working to build and um, cultivate for our community.
Totally. I actually think it wouldn't be a bad thing for us to maybe kind of talk about the physical nature of the workshop, and also its totally non-physical nature. I think one of the things, at least for me, that has been so moving about being part of the AAWW like community has been the fact that, like, I'm originally from New York, but then I spent over a decade being nowhere near New York. And I think I'm back on the East Coast now, but all those years in the middle, I still felt very much a part of the Asian American Writers Workshop. And that was really because you guys had such an online presence. And talk about like finding writing community. I mean, I edited a collection of Asian American essays. Like, where do you find the people who are going to write for that? Like, this was a big part of that. Like, how do you even go about finding that community? Like, it didn't matter where I was living. I've lived in Wisconsin, I've lived in Tennessee, I've lived in India, I've lived in the UK. Like, like I was always coming back to this space to look for that community. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what, yeah, I mean, I know you guys have been more online in the era of Zoom, but I think that there was a real online community aspect to the AAWW even beyond that and beyond New York.
Totally. And I think, it goes back to a couple of things. It goes back to what we talked about earlier related to this very broad definition of Asian American and consequentially the transnational nature of our work, right? What does it mean when you have this broad term that encompasses so many different countries, so many different nations, so many different individual communities? You have to think outside of your specific physical space. That's just like you can't do that. It's you can't separate the two. Um, and so even before the pandemic, and definitely before my time, even there was always a concerted effort to take what was happening in whatever physical space the workshop was in, whatever office it was in, whatever event space it was in, um, and making it accessible to an audience far beyond New York. The YouTube archive, I think, is a really wonderful example of that.
Oh,
Our
yeah.
events have been recorded and uploaded and available for viewing for years, and it's a treasure trove, right, of conversations and dialogues. And so you know silver linings are few and hard to find this past year, but if there's one, it would be um we've really been able to take that commitment that existed long before the pandemic, and really run with it this year and think even more broadly about, okay, it's not even about broadcasting what's happening in the physical space outside of New York. It's actually considering, the nation, the globe, any big container part of our larger community. And so what does that mean? Um, Programmatically, it's meant we can I think of a book launch we did last year for Kazim Ali, for his collection The Voice of Sheila Chandra. And Kazim's on the West Coast. He was in conversation with Rajiv Mohabir, who's on the East Coast, and they had a special guest appearance from Sheila Chandra herself, who's in the UK. So it's like that type of event actually probably wouldn't have happened if we weren't all working from home and if we weren't in this weird kind of remote bubble. So we've really just been running with the fact that our community does extend so far beyond the physical space in New York City, and embracing it and really honoring it. And I think it's important, just, it's connection is so hard to find these past few months, this past year. And so, what are we doing where it's not just like taking a panel discussion and throwing it up on Zoom, but thinking really intentionally about ways to foster, again, that same feeling that people have from being together in a room. And, I'll end by just saying I'll give an example of something we've been doing on the program side. We leave the Zoom chat open for about 10 to 15 minutes after every public event that we've been doing, all of which has been virtual. Um, and it's been this really interesting replication of like the milling about that happens after an event, and like your chance to say hi to people or ask the question that you didn't have a chance to ask during the official program. And it's not the same obviously as being together in person, but it comes a close second. And in some ways, when you think about accessibility and communities that maybe aren't able to attend physical events, in some ways it's even more inclusive than connecting in person might be.
Absolutely. I mean, I've felt that even, and it's actually not just the Zoom chat, it's also the YouTube chat, I think, for the live events. They're both really active. And every time I've attended an event, or every time I've participated in an event, even, I think that's been actually a really big part of it. Because of course, one of the big things you miss about the in-person events is the milling around afterwards, and the seeing all your friends and the people you didn't know and talking to them about what this was. And, that does sort of provide something. And again, it's not about the Zoom chat or the YouTube chat. It's about who is in the room, right?
Mhm.
Like, it's really, who does the Asian American Writers Workshop invite into that chat? And that is really what I think is so special about this particular mixture.
And I
Um,
think
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just add one thing. In addition to kind of the post-event chat, the one thing that I've also noticed that has been really interesting is the chat that happens during an event.
Yeah.
Because traditionally during an event, like, you're not talking, right? You're in the audience, it's silent, you're listening to what's happening. But in this age of, virtual events and Zoom and YouTube and everything, there's almost a parallel conversation happening, and like this parallel dialogue. And it's so warm and it's so supportive. And I think back to a big poetry reading we did early in the pandemic, actually co-sponsored with Pen America. And it was a pre-recorded event. So poets, submitted their readings. And I think we had about like 20 poets featured, but a lot of them showed up to the live streaming of the event and were just cheering each other on in the chat. And again, it's this like warmth and support that you really crave during an in-person event. I think there are still ways that we've been working to foster that, even when everybody's just, home in front of their own computer.
Yeah, 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 that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I think have been very much, one of the ways in which I feel like I'm very much involved in the Asian American Writers Workshop, even when I'm not physically in New York and when I'm sitting in front of my computer screen, is absolutely the literary magazine, The Margins. I think that's been also the other thing. about the workshop. This is why, like, and every time I think about the workshop, I'm like, it has so many arms, like it has so many, it's reaching in so many directions, you know, like on the, it's like fellowships, and then you're doing the author readings, and then you're doing the Q&As, and the sort of like directed like sort of panels, and then there's also, it runs its own magazine. And so you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about with the margins is this idea. I was really attracted to. I think you guys have been doing recently this thing called a folio, and it's been a really cool way to see groups of ideas pulled together. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the folios are, and also I think the fellows are quite involved in the folios, and it's not just the margins team who are doing them always. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the folios are really wonderful. I think, I think they happened in the past more sporadically, this idea of kind of clustering pieces of work around a similar theme. One thing that we've really done in the past year, not just with the magazine, but across all of our work, is to just be more intentional. Not doing things for the sake of doing them, and really thinking about the value add of any given program, project, piece, whatever. And the folios, I think, are just a really way of bringing an important sense of intentionality to the magazine. It forces the editors to really think critically around a certain issue or a certain topic. But I think also it opens up this whole new approach of multidisciplinary work. You can
It can
have.
be anything, like if a folio is on, I know one of the recent ones was like land, but it can
Mhm.
be, you can submit a poem, you can submit a piece of fiction, you can submit a piece of nonfiction, I don't know, a piece of a script, whatever, but it
Exactly.
has to be about this idea.
Yeah,
Okay.
totally. And so it can be any piece of work. And we bring on guest editors. We have, of course, our editorial team. We do have a rotating set of editors, which is intentional also because we always want constantly different perspectives. And, um, it's just a really beautiful way to kind of approach any given topic versus just like, let's have a piece about the importance of land and, what it means for a certain community. What does it actually mean to engage with that topic, right? Across different genres. And you mentioned the fellows. It's also, again, been a really great way for the fellows to be involved with editorial work. And, for a lot of them, this might be the first time they're working on an editing project. It might be the first time that they're reviewing pitches or going through that. It's a skill set, right? And so when we think about ways that we're supporting writers, providing fellows this opportunity to maybe guest edit a folio for the magazine, um, it's a level of work experience that I think helps enhance their fellowship year. Um, the folios also, I think, they really help us just to think outside the box in terms of what we're writing about and publishing in the magazine, and be really creative. I mean, we just published our latest folio is from the Trans-Pacific Literary Project, which is an editorial project focused on translation and writing from Southeast Asia, focused on lullabies and this idea of, both the soothing nature of lullabies, but also the the darker undertones that sometimes exist. Yeah, they're a little creepy, right? And what's interesting is they're creepy across multiple cultures. It's not just that, like, oh, this region's lullabies can be kind of creepy. No, there's like a universal creepiness for lullabies across the world. And so this folio, this collection of work, it includes audio clips. Each piece, whether it's a poem, whether it's a long form essay, whatever it is, each one's accompanied with an audio because that's so critical to the understanding of lullabies and kind of the musicality of it. And so it just allows us to be more creative, and I think bring in a new dimension to the types of things we're writing about. I mean, so often I feel like as like an Asian American organization or even just any race specific organization, you often spend a lot of time writing about like who you are and your identity and all, which are important issues and certainly ones to contend with. But I think with the magazine in particular, we think a lot about like just producing like really interesting creative work, and not tying ourselves to, say, our persecution or, these identity politics, right? Let's make room for joy and hope and creativity, and the folios are a really amazing vehicle to do that.
I love the phrase "not tying ourselves to our persecution," our all our sorrows. We're not just our sorrows, and any race-based organization in the United States is going to have some kind of mandate to focus on their own sorrows, and that I feel like is something that there's so much Asian American joy to be found, and in creepy lullabies or whatever.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. My last two questions are really kind of more about you, if you don't mind. I know partially I just want to give you a chance to talk about you came on as director of the Asian American Writers Workshop like 2 weeks before quarantine or something.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
so you've actually been in this position for an entire year, maybe a little more, but that year has been a really weird one. And I'm wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about like what the challenges of that have been, but also like what the excitement of that has been, and how you've been doing like really incredible work even despite that, and like what have been the opportunities that have come up for you that have been cool despite all of this.
Yeah, I think, so I started at the end of January. I had one full month. We had February in the office, and then March, everything kind of shut down. And it's not the transition I thought I would be having, for sure. But I think also it's forced the organization to really focus internally, which I think is important. I'm kind of like I come at this from a nerdy nonprofit perspective of like the need to have a strong organizational foundation, and have like the right team in place, and a lot of the nuts and bolts of running an organization that sometimes, especially for nonprofits, you don't really have the time to focus on, because everything is so fast paced and you're running from this project to the next. I think, again, looking for the few silver linings that do exist in this past year, that ability to really look inward, which is something that I think is important for any transition, for any new person kind of coming in to any organization. We were given that moment, and we added new staff members to the team. The folios are a good example of how we've really restructured a lot of how the editorial team works. We've revamped, how we approach public programming. We've been able to really kind of take a step back and think, you know, how do we want to be working and doing this work, in a way that feels right, and in a way that also is appropriate for this particular moment. So, for me personally, and on behalf of the organization, I think being given that moment of introspection has actually been really beneficial for not just me but the team as a whole. And we've done what we can to try to stay connected. It's weird not like having your coworkers with you every day. We've done like, we play games on this app called House Party once in a while, where we'll do like a round of Uno. We had like a virtual holiday party, and we've definitely tried to find, as we talked about, moments of joy and ways to stay connected, even as we're all in our own homes. The other thing for me personally, as I think about just like being a South Asian woman and being a Bangladeshi woman, um, I've been thinking a lot about, we talked earlier about the role that the workshop has in incubating the next generation of storytellers, which I think is so important to the mission. But I personally am really interested in also, um, honoring the traditions that we come from, and in a lot of ways kind of redefining the notion of what is classical. When somebody thinks about like classical literature, it's often defined from a Western perspective, and that's just not true, right? I mean, there are plenty of classical writers and artists from multiple Asian traditions. And so how do we not only think about the future and the next generation of artists and writers, but what are we doing to um, honor and pay homage to these rich cultural traditions that we come from. And so it's a little bit of doing two things at the same time, but it's something that drew me to wanting to be a part of the workshop to begin with, and is just, I'm a firm believer in understanding where we come from in order to really successfully move forward and go on. And so that duality of our traditions along with the future is something that I think a lot about, and hope to bring, more of in the workshop and its offerings. We're working on a project related, for example, to Bangladesh's Independence Day. The 50th independence year is coming up this month, and um, things like that, where I think we can not only create the future, but at the same time really respect and honor where we came from.
It's really really exciting to hear you say that. And partially it's I mean it's exciting to hear about your whole journey to the workshop in general, and I really hope for all of our sakes that we can do some in-person stuff soon. But it's also, my sort of last question to you was going to be kind of along these lines, about this idea of, you know at least for me, when I just personally, when I heard that you were going to be directing the workshop, it was so exciting for me to hear that another South Asian American woman from the New York area who went to a women's college, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, was going to be directing the workshop, but also a Bangla sister. Like, that was really, really exciting for me to see. And I think, one of the things that's been really cool about, sort of seeing you in this role has also been this idea that, like, at least for me as an artist, I think so much of my art has been about taking those cultural traditions that I grew up with. And Bengal is really strong about its own cultural traditions, as so many cultures are. But that's so much a part of my art, I think, and so much a part of our collective art discussion, is to say, like, how can we sort of pull all of that into the fusion of what we are doing now. And I guess I just wanted to end on asking you, like, how it has been for you, coming at this role as a South Asian American woman, as a Bangla speaking woman, as all of those things, as a Bangladeshi American woman in the 50th year of Bangla independence, like all of that. Like,
Yeah.
how have you been feeling about all of that?
It's been it's a role that I don't take lightly, kind of first and foremost. It's something, I think, I'm biased and I think our community is brilliant because they are, right? And we have amazing artists and writers and storytellers, both in our traditions and also in our present. I think the other thing that I think often about is um, being able to understand the challenges and tensions that come with certain identities also. So, again, this ability to kind of do two things at the same time that we've talked about, we can honor and respect the traditions we come from, but also really hold the tensions that come with even the term South Asian, right? And the systems of patriarchy and casteism and, you know, other not so joyful, not so positive things that are associated with our identity and with our community. I don't think one has to be at the expense of the other.
No,
Um,
and it's more like a conversation of all of those things, right? I mean, like, when we say sort of like Asian culture or South Asian culture, or, even sort of specifics to that. First of all, the word South and East, these are really contested words to begin with. And secondly, when we say the word culture, I mean, what does that even mean? I mean, like, all cultures include rape culture. All cultures include sort of misogynistic cultures, and all, like, these are all parts of these, even the traditions that you're talking about, sort of fusing with our current art. Like, all of that whole conversation needs to be brought into this, right?
Totally. And I think a part of it is I was reading an article actually related to this new Netflix show called Bling Empire, which is a reality show that I'm sure many are aware of. But it brought up this term, um, the challenges that come with when your community is not in the majority, when you're kind of like an underrepresented community. There's this pressure that everything that is said publicly about who you are and where you come from needs to be positive and needs to kind of put us in this right light, because um, we have so few chances, right, to tell our stories, to be on these main stages. And this article actually talked about kind of the refreshing mediocrity of a show like Bling Empire and the progress that comes from just having this like actually not that interesting reality show about our people and that being okay. And I think Viet Thanh Nguyen also talks often about like the advantages of multiplicity for white communities that you know BIPOC communities just don't have, right? And so we put almost too much pressure on ourselves. Um, so in that spirit, for me more than anything, I am just really excited and honored to have this ability to an opportunity to amplify some of the amazing work that we're doing and that our community is doing. And it's a personal joy for me to work with and engage with writers and musicians and artists who I just love on a personal level.
Yeah.
And so being able to have this platform and support um, my personal community along with the broader community, it's a real joy. And it's been a challenging year, but I'm really proud of the work that we've done. I think we've managed to be a really important source of comfort and care for a lot of our community during a really challenging time. And um, I'm hoping that we can continue to do that, but also, um, take the organization to its kind of next era, next phase. Um, Hopefully when we kind of reconvene in person later this year or next.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking about like the complicated nature of all these conversations. And I read the article that you were mentioning, and I think it was Jean Ho that wrote it. And I was thinking about the idea of mediocrity and also the idea of multiplicity and the lack of a single story, as the saying goes. And I feel like one of the things about the workshop that has been really exciting to sort of watch this conversation grow is its or at least what I find when I come to these spaces is I find a willingness to sit with the uncomfortable, and I find a willingness to sit in conversations about what is classical, as which is a word that you used, and how that word is both positive and negative, and how even the term Asian American is positive and negative, and how like everything we do is contradictory to something else we've done, and that's life, and that's also being sort of hyphenated American, and that's it's all of those things. But I really appreciate our conversation willing it to hold complexity, and allowing it to hold complexity. So thank you so much for being here with me today, and I really really appreciate what this has been and what this continues to be, and I hope we can see each other in person really soon.
Thanks so much, Piyali. One day, we're working on
Working on it.
it.